Hello, and welcome to the Chicago Humanities Festival, and today's program, Alexis Coe on George Washington. My name is Travis Whitlow. You can learn more about our upcoming events at chicagohumanities.org and also support them by donating or becoming a member. Thanks to our captioner for making this event more accessible. All digital events have closed captioning, which can be controlled through YouTube. You can learn more about our accessible services at chicagohumanities.org/access. This week's programs are presented with the support of Bank of America. Please help me and welcome Louise Bernard and Alexis Coe.
Hi, thank you, Travis, for that introduction, for that welcome. My name is Louise Bernard. I am the director of the Obama Presidential Center Museum, and it is such an honor to be here this evening with Alexis Coe, who is the author of You Never Forget Your First, a biography of George Washington. So welcome, Alexis, to the Chicago Humanities Festival. We're just going to dive right into what I find to be just a wonderfully engaging and energizing biography of the nation's first president. And I do actually want to begin with this concept of biography, really your approach to the genre itself. And very specifically, the genre of presidential biography, which is often understood as a kind of hagiography. We think about the celebration of the great man, so to speak, in which there's a knowing embrace of a certain kind of mythos. So we think naturally of the presidential biography as being this very weighty, multi-volumed, magisterial kind of work. And you refer to this idea of kind of dad history. And it is a particular history that is written often by white men, for a general white male readership. But yet you begin your biography with George Washington at a glance, 1732 to 1799, in which you distill all of his attributes, his accomplishments, his sensibility into a series of kind of bullet-pointed lists. And this is a technique that we'll find throughout the book. It's a certain kind of tabulation or taxonomy that works as a framing device. And it really draws the reader in. And so I'd love to hear from you how you kind of began this work of actually approaching George Washington and how you began to frame an understanding of biography.
I think your diction was correct. You said that presidential history often honors the man, and in particular, presidential biographies honor or even genuflect in the direction of the president. And then we have microhistories, which I always think of as having excellent biographies within them. They seem to accomplish just as much in a couple hundred pages as presidential biographers do in full books. And when I say microhistories, I tend to think of them as a sort of side approach to the president. So Annette Gordon-Reed, of course, all of her work on Jefferson and the Hemings. I think of Erica Dunbar and her work on Ona Judge and George Washington. They tell us the entire presidential biography, and I've always been so impressed by that, while telling us concurrently someone else's story and without letting this great man dominate. When I think about presidential history, I often see, for example, on Mount Vernon's website, we have a very good working relationship and they know that I feel this way. They use the word honor. We honor George Washington's legacy. To me, a research library is there to provide access to the archives, to facilitate research, to engage the public. Honor is a personal choice. Celebrating someone is a decision that you make if you want to emulate a person, if you want them to be your role model. That is absolutely fine, but that should not be where we start. And I brought that perspective to the form of biography, which does tend to be dominated by men, and in particular white men. But I've never seen anything like it as a presidential historian outside of Washington studies. It was really distinct, and yet I didn't actually realize the numbers until I was years into the project. But I really felt like, okay, I want this to be, I want to assume I know the basics about George Washington, but as any good historian will do, they will approach a project and say, okay, I know what I know. And I'm also aware I don't know lots of things, and I've got to figure that out. So I sort of approached it as if I was ready to be surprised. I took nothing for granted. I took, often in biographies or in history books, you will see a little endnote, a little footnote, it'll refer you to the citations. You'll go to the citation, you'll see the book that they cite is a secondary source. It's not the primary source. And you keep following that thread, and you find that you actually never get to a primary source. Mm-hmm. Everyone has just been quoting each other forever. And so I kept seeing these confirmations everywhere that I had to sort of tear it down. I also at the same time had a competing agenda in which I wanted presidential history not only to obviously be written by a woman, this is just what I happen to do, but I wanted it to be accessible to people who feel like they are outside dad history. And it's not, this is what I call it, this is what other youngish historians call it, and now sort of everyone does as a joke, sort of tongue in cheek, but it is in fact true. The publishing industry puts these books out. We see them at Barnes & Noble on Father's Day, nice big sale. And I wanted them to rethink Washington in this way that I was rethinking Washington. But I also wanted people who felt really left out by the genre, women, people of color across the board. I wanted them to feel like they could proceed as experts. They had everything that they wanted. And this wasn't some sort of, you don't have to make it 800 pages to earn all this information. I wanted you to go into every chapter feeling like your own expert. And like you could then proceed with the information that you needed, the vital information to assess what was going on. I'm not telling you to emulate him or revere him or be repulsed. We're approaching him with wide open eyes.
I love that idea of really coming to Washington anew in a certain way. And I think this has much to do with your desire to write about him holistically, that you didn't want to kind of separate out these discrete topics that are supposedly the purview of women historians. And you note this in terms of how people responded to the project. What is your book about? And they wanted to know whether it was about his marriage or you reference this here about his wife, about his social life. And you would say, no, it's a biography like a man would write. And so at the same time, I am really interested in how you did approach the women who feature in this particular telling of Washington's life. And I mean, not just his mother, Mary, or his wife, Martha, but the women he relied on, for example, for intelligence during the war. It was wonderful for me to discover the figure of Lydia Darrah. She's actually referenced in your endnotes. Or importantly, Mary Thompson, who you describe in your acknowledgements as, quote, the greatest living Washington scholar. And of course, we think about the known and unknown enslaved women of Mount Vernon, Washington's plantation. But let's start with the principles, with Mary and Martha, and really understand them as you have framed them in terms of this broader re-energizing of the history around Washington the man.
There was an axiomatic approach to women in Washington biographies. Mary, bad. Mm-hmm. Martha, good. And I always say with Martha, don't be fooled by the bonnet. Look at her letters. Just look at her letters. It doesn't take that much to see the way that she describes enslaved people, the way that she talks about her role as the first lady, the way that she talks about Washington, disease, Virginia, colony, it's all there. But in the tradition, when Washington died, he was our country. He was the symbol of the country to the world and to the nation. And we were creating stories about ourselves. And one of the stories we'd like to tell was that he was very good, because if Washington was born great and good, then so were we. And in order to do that, he had to have had, wonderful, loving mother. As attitudes towards mothers changed over time, that story changed dramatically. And this is sort of the fun of bibliography and of historiography, is you go through and you look at the way someone has been treated over time. And luckily we live in a relatively young country, so we can actually do that. With Mary in particular, I thought it was very strange how uniform everyone was. You know, Martha gets a pass. That was easy to check. And there's some talk about that among women historians. Didn't see it in the interpretations of male biographers, which is, by the way, when I'm talking about the numbers, I'm talking about hundreds of men over 100 years. And I'm talking about 3 women, including myself, over 100 years. And I'm the only woman biographer. And that's not a brag. That is a very sad state of affairs. The Mary in particular, I found, was assigned this kind of derision that felt uncomfortable. And I would come across words that I would never use to describe a subject, male or female, like crusty. And those are feelings, I would never describe anyone in my life that way, but there were things I had just never read before. And these were I have a chart, which was made, much was made of it when the book came out. And that was also sort of surprising to me. But I started to collect the words that were used, and Ron Chernow happened to use a lot of them because his book is quite long. And one of the words he used was illiterate. And illiterate is a really interesting, as the kids would say, burn, because it is either literal, you cannot read or write, or, as we have found in our study of the past, it is a judgment. It is a class judgment. It is an othering. And much was made about how Martha read novels. Martha was really wealthy. She married, Washington was her second husband. She was one of the richest women in Virginia when he met her, and she was in her late 20s. Mary, on the other hand, to me is Mary Washington, a wonderful American story. She was born to an indentured servant. She marries well. She ends up raising the first president of the United States, someone who rebels against the crown. Why don't we talk about Mary Washington when we talk about the great tradition of presidents who came from single mothers? We talk about Ford, even Andrew Jackson, and of course, Obama. These are important stories for us to know, and yet that wasn't true. So back to literate. This is something that is too easy for us to check, and this was what was shocking about this discovery I made. She has letters in the archives. We can look at them. She has books at the Washington Library, which she annotated, but they happen to be Bibles. And that's the way she spoke. She spoke quite plainly, in dramatic terms, and she was not educated in any sort of formal way because, again, she was born to an indentured servant, and this is a great American story. And once I realized, okay, if they're, to be quite frank, going to be that lazy about women, they just don't care enough to research them, I again need to I cannot assume anything. And then I thought, okay, I need to look at his days as I would if I was at a modern presidential library and I was able to access their daily schedules, which tell you so much. I need to figure that out from these incredibly lengthy letters. What's he actually doing? Because I'm only hearing about the important stuff that, has to do with national and international interest. But who's handing him his pen? Who's waving a fan at him? I know this is going on, so that needs to be in there. That can't just be one chapter. There can't be one person meant to represent hundreds of people. We need to live life as he did. We need to see that. And in order to see that, Hamilton is as important as the 14 people working in Washington's presidential home. Both of those people are as important, both of them, one-to-one, and then all of them need to come in. All of them. Everyone comes through the house. They are all equal people, because when we say, oh, he was a man of his time, so were they.
Mm-hmm.
So were they.
Just to think again, before we kind of move into, I do want to touch on, obviously, the issue of slavery as it pertains to understanding Washington and understanding the plantation economy, of which she was very much a part. But again, to go back to those interstitial kind of female figures, the Lydia Tarras, and also the historian Mary Thompson. But tell us a little bit about the women that you found in the so-called margins of history, so to speak, and the choices you had to make as to how you would frame them or introduce them, the role of the endnotes, for example, and what that means in terms of your own conceptualization of this particular history.
Endnotes are not only for citations. You can find some really good information. You can also find, as you did, the interests and passions of the historian outside of the preface and introduction. It is a roadmap to their, through their heart up to their brain. And to me, when we typically, you're mentioning women from the war, and when we typically hear about women during wartime, they are victims, not survivors, they're victims of some sort of brutality of men. They are domestic witnesses, which means that they observed something happening, whether they lived with a great man, they saw someone coming through, they saw an incident, or they're being written to. They're not actual people. They don't have roles. And we know that women were terribly inventive during wartime, that they played important roles in the efforts, that they were following around camps if they were able to, of soldiers, and they were spying. And they used their positions. Sometimes this was a part of an official network, and sometimes it was simply them doing what they knew they could do in the moment when they could do it. So in particular, there were women in Philadelphia who had boarding houses, who had meeting places where British soldiers would come, or Hessians would come, German mercenaries who were hired by the British. And she literally, she put her head down and she just listened to their whole conversation. And then she was so crafty. She put little notes in her youngest son's buttons. She sewed them in. She sent him off to go deliver something to his older brother. We got information. And this kept happening over and over again, women putting out laundry on clotheslines. And I really wanted to show that they were active participants. And sort of the problem there is, one, that there's not a lot about them, because in order to be a good spy, we really can't know that much about you. And then, of course, women, again, are only collected if they are viewed as domestic witnesses. And that means that you have to have some position of importance. You have to be central. You have to be Martha Washington. You can't necessarily be a random woman who's running a boarding house who does this amazing thing. We learn about her from letters. And so that's really challenging too. And this happens, it's the most heartbreaking part of dealing with slavery and dealing with a president who owns people. You never hear them. You hear all these things about them. People have made leaps based on that, and you just cannot get that close. And it's really a matter of trusting and not trusting. With those sources, I really wanted to squeeze as much as I responsibly could. And then you do have women who have been doing this work even before they were given titles that would suggest they were doing this work, like Mary Thompson at Mount Vernon, who has worked there, I think, for 40 or 50 years. And she has sort of come up through the archive. She has all the research that exists there, and all the research that has come out of there comes from this one woman. And she is, I say, as you noted, the greatest living expert. I saw someone once wrote about her that she's forgotten more things than most Washington experts remember. I think any of those things are true. Now, Mary Thompson is not a household name.
Right.
She has launched so many. She's not eligible for the George Washington Prize of $50,000. She has helped every single person get it. And then, of course, there's the limitation. Mary Thompson, chief researcher, is a white woman in Virginia.
Yeah. And so I do want to, I'm really interested in the way in which these seemingly marginal lives, or lives that are not dominant or central in the historical record, certainly tell us so much. And I think about this also in terms of the very particular choices that you make as a historian. And one of the key choices that you make, and I find it to be a really wonderful gesture in many ways, but a very almost kind of defiant gesture, which is that you again reduce into tabulated form Washington's Revolutionary War. It becomes a list of the battles because the point being, you really want to understand the man who was not himself on the battlefield, and to understand his life in relationship to the war. Again, his life in kind of the fullest, more fulsome sense. So again, could you talk a little bit about that particular choice? And I do find it interesting to think about that in terms of both the publishing world, the kind of conversations you may have had with your agent or your editor about that kind of a gesture, which is really speaking volumes in and of itself.
Absolutely. I have obviously read a great deal of George Washington biographies, and I did feel as if they followed a pattern. And one of the curious choices about that pattern is to spend 10, 20, 30 pages on battles he wasn't at and he corresponded about, but there was nothing particularly moving about his letters or his involvement. You know, there was a certain amount of self-direction from generals who are quite gifted. Benedict Arnold was one of his best generals, and yet so much time spent on them, and they don't bring us closer to him. And that is everyone's stated goal. Every Washington biographer bemoans, they say, he's too marvel to be real. I'm going to, get you close as possible. We can't do that if we're literally colonies away. And so I wanted to stay close to him. I also think it makes him a lot more interesting. I wouldn't say that everyone knows that he lost more battles than he won, but I would say that most people do not understand that he had such an incredible role in spying, and also that he loved it. So people talk about how Washington really kept his feelings to himself. He kept his cards, close. And I think that is true to a certain extent if you're only looking for specific things. But if you're looking for his relationship with someone, if you're looking for him to be a negligent, if you're looking, you're saying, hey, you haven't visited your mom, she's dying, you haven't returned her letter, you're being you're being kind of a jerk in this other way. It's there. You're not necessarily looking for these moments of triumph or deep patriotism or realizations. And so spying, and also, if you're looking, you're saying, I thought was something that would surprise people. And also, if you're coming at Washington from a Jefferson perspective or Hamiltonian or any of these other branches of the founding fathers, which do tend to get a little bit more attention because they're viewed as more exciting, or you struggle with Jefferson, his hypocrisy, his beautiful words, and then how could, you don't have that with Washington. And so I wanted to complicate people's perception of not just the things that are difficult to deal with, but also the things that are good. And we have to learn to hold those things at once. I do not think that people really understood, okay, you can say that Washington is the symbol of America and that he is very interested in nation building. But if you talk to us in real time about he's already worried about it the first 6 months of the revolution, that tells me something. And then I know to look out for ways that he's trying to frame the country's narrative, not only for itself, but for the world. He really was quite political. So the founding fathers will say, oh, he had a deficient education, and Washington will say that. But he's brilliant in a lot of ways that he does not get credit for. And sometimes that's really difficult too. He was quite exploitive. There's usually another woman, Phyllis Wheatley, fascinating character in American history. And I say character because she has been used every which way. And one of the ways in which Washington used her, she was famous at the time, she was still enslaved, and she wrote him an ode. And Washington got the ode, and he was very aware of perceptions, and he desperately wanted it published, but couldn't send it to an editor. So he sent it to a friend and said, oh, I wish this woman would get published more. She's just wonderful. And And of course it got published. And then, to Washington's despair, he had to greet Phyllis Wheatley. And the way dad historians will talk about this, and the way sort of traditional white male historians, they'll say, you know, this was an occasion, and Washington rose to the occasion. He welcomed an enslaved woman into his home. He was deeply uncomfortable with the whole thing. He didn't want to do it. He didn't like the way he had to address her. When she walked into his home, she didn't knock on the door, and Washington opened the door and said, "Welcome to Mount Vernon." She passed possibly hundreds of enslaved people on her way in, and these were not people she grew up in a home, and she was certainly enslaved, but she was a part of a family, whereas this was not happening at Mount Vernon. This was a working plantation. These people were working, and as observers had told us from their letters, and they can be trusted. They have no agenda. In fact, they're often pro-slavery. They will say that they are not well attired, that they're in tatters, that they seem hungry. And that is what Phyllis Wheatley saw when she came, and Washington sort of gritting and bearing it. And I think that's really important. And I think it's important to also think about Phyllis Wheatley as a human and what she might have been trying to accomplish as not just a poet who is a paragraph in our textbooks, but as a person in America who was trying to reach out to powerful men and understood that she had a platform. And I think that's an example of also someone who we know and don't know a lot about. And we have to fill in the blanks. And there's been some really interesting work happening around that with women historians and even women who work in the field of literature.
It's interesting that you raise Wheatley. And again, I often think about her in Jefferson's Notes on the State of Virginia, Query 14. In which you see how the figure of the African American, and certainly the figure of the poet, the Black poet, is actually registered within this Enlightenment thinking. And it's truly this revelation of kind of Jeffersonian insight in terms of how Black subjectivity is understood. And I do wonder then, in thinking about Phyllis Wheatley and her arrival at Mount Vernon, the role of public history, the role of a certain kind of monumentalism. And now we see how there is a call for various forms of decolonization or the pulling down of monuments, rethinking monumental culture, rethinking the commemorative landscape. And I wonder about your relationship to Mount Vernon itself, to the interpretive work that is being done around the plantation space, and how that also registered or figures within this particular work, which on the one hand is incredibly jaunty. There's a lot of kind of levity, playfulness to the work of the biography, but clearly in discourse always with the specter of a Mount Vernon, for example. And you were very direct in referring to the plantation as a forced labor camp. This is a term that we find directly in Nicole Hannah Jones and the 1619 project. And so I just wonder about how, again, you think of the balance between the joyfulness, the energized, the levity of this particular approach, and then the specter of the history that you're also engaging with.
It's such an interesting question. There are a lot of questions there. I think the 1619 project is seemingly divisive because it is compared to celebratory history, which is goes by the name, I guess, of 1776. And what we need to remember, I don't really know about 1776 because it's not actually an entity yet. But what we need to remember about the 1619 project is it is not a historical text. It's not yet a textbook. It's going to go through a lot of different, anyone who's made anything collaboration knows that that is going to be a very lengthy process with a lot of eyes on it. This was something that a journalist wrote. And there's sort of one thing that we all disagree on with this again, or if I haven't said it, this incredible approach to our founding, which is that the revolution was equal parts about slavery and about breaking away from the crown. They were aware of the world changing, and of course of certain court cases, and that Virginians in particular, we've named quite a few, Washington, Jefferson, Madison, we could keep going. They, of course, their livelihood was in people, in owning them. That was their property. They were cash poor. And when we say land rich, we don't just mean land. We mean the people working the land too. They were aware of that. And of course, that wealth allowed them to rebel in a lot of ways, but it wasn't equally about that. However, the project has energized the country in good and bad ways, very in not a dissimilar way to Hamilton, which had a very different reception when it came out this year on Disney Plus versus on the stage years ago. Historians always talked about this. No one really cared that much about our debates, though, until this year around these concepts, around 1619 and about Hamilton. But Hamilton in particular, wonderful, brilliant. We all know this from a musical theater perspective, from an entertainment perspective. But when you have people of color playing the roles of white men, and you have barely any mention of slavery, next to no context when Jefferson hands Sally Hemings a jacket, it's a tragedy. It is a missed opportunity of epic proportions. And on Twitter this year, Lin-Manuel Miranda said that. He said he understood it, and this has been a long time coming. So those are those two projects. And then we sort of back up to my relationship with Mount Vernon, which has obviously evolved over years. I sort of purposely laid low. And to be quite honest, no one was really talking to me except for Mary Thompson and other people in the library. I would go to the symposiums. It was a sea of white people, mostly older. And then, they were very excited about the book and they reached out. They asked for a copy. And obviously researchers there sort of knew what I was after and what I was doing. I also, by the way, hired a fact checker, the most senior presidential historian at the George Washington Papers at the University of Virginia, which was one of my favorite correspondents in many ways because he challenged me. So I always think that you should find someone to be a second reader who, questions you, but also realizes when things need to change. And this was the wonderful role of Bill Ferrero, one of my favorite people, who was on my daughter's Zoom first birthday. And that is essential. So they asked for the book. They absolutely knew, everything about it and my approach. And the day the book came out, as I was on a train to Mount Vernon from Brooklyn, New York to, right outside of DC, my New York Times op-ed was published in which, I talk about how I very much disagree with the way that they summarize Washington's final act of, manumission, of emancipating the enslaved community. And I'm not the only one. Charles Blow has regularly tweeted about this in the last year. A lot of people have, and they've changed a word or two there, but it's still wildly misleading. When they introduced me to an audience that looked just like that symposium, with the exception of one Black person, my friend Marcia Chatlin from Georgetown, a great historian who has a book out called Franchise, she was the one person, and she said that she would never go back there after she was on a tour that greatly misrepresented slavery. And I think that is a problem that plantations have. And they are a place that white people can go and be comfortable. And Black people don't go near and are very uncomfortable with, for the most part. And that is something that needs to change. Mount Vernon, I spent the night there. I love them. I've done many events, but we have, what I think of as a really good relationship because we don't agree on a lot of things and yet we still come together. I think they have a really long way to go. And I'm hoping, I was not satisfied with the changes that happened this year at all. And I just think if you look at them compared to Monticello is the gold standard, you can't go anywhere on their website without seeing something addressing Sally Hemings. And here's the thing. We know as historians, everything everyone's going to say to us, an average visitor, an average reader, it's the same questions. And so there's absolutely no reason not to be straightforward and clear about it, as Monticello does. They have this great page where they're just like, what about this? What about this? What about this? And they just answer it. And it's a beautiful display of public history. It not only leans on Annette Gordon-Reed, but a whole diverse set of people. So you're hearing it coming from different places. I should probably be specific about this point of contention. And I should also say that Mount Vernon is run by the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, the Ladies of Mount Vernon, which predates the Daughters of the Revolution. They are around 22 people, women. They're self-selecting. We don't know anything about it. Their archives are sealed. Photos through their history can tell us some things and names. By my count, they've had one Black woman in the last 10 years. That was short-lived. And otherwise, it is a self-selecting group of 22 women, most of whom you can see have other affiliations with conservative think tanks. And one of the other donors is, for example, Newt Gingrich, who has also written about Washington and produced a documentary. And, so you have sort of a conservative donor base coupled with almost an entirely white staff that in no way reflects, at the time of Washington's death, 90% of Mount Vernon was Black. And now it is, you'd be lucky if it was 10%, and there are entire parts of Mount Vernon that are completely white. They had a exhibition on slavery that was curated by a white woman with a team of white women. And there are just obvious things that need to change. But again, coming back to Washington's final act, their telling is that Washington made, they use this word, the bold choice to emancipate his slaves upon his death outright. They use the word outright. They said he was the only founding father to do so. It is wildly tricky language. I run it by historians, obviously, but also Benjamin Dreyer, who wrote Dreyer's English, who is the chief of copy and at Random House, Penguin Random House, where I'm published. And he had a whole bunch of ideas I had never even thought of, agreed with me, but outright, the definition means right away, without condition. That only happened to one man, Billy Lee, who all of the dad historians we've discussed treat as if he is the stand-in, which in modern terms we would call a token, right? He is the one person who is meant to represent all of the Black people. That's not true, because the other people did not receive their freedom the day he died. Only one person did, who had been crippled in Washington's service. Now, this is William Lee, which is what he liked to be called. Billy Lee is what everyone else called him. He was famous during his lifetime. He was known as you see him, if you see a Black man in a portrait, it is William Lee with Washington or with his family. It gets complicated from there because Washington had two wills, quite dramatically. I always say you don't need fiction. You can't make this stuff up. The night that Washington dies, he tells Martha to go get two wills. It's not clear that Martha knows there's a second will. She only knows about the one that's been around for decades that he had prepared by an attorney. The summer before he dies in December of 1799, he writes his own will. And he puts in this part, but he says, okay, William Lee, free outright. Everyone else who I own, who does not belong to Martha through her first marriage, but they have married and they have had children, so it gets pretty complicated. Everyone I know own 117 people. They will be free when Martha dies or at her discretion. Early in our conversation, I said it's quite clear how Martha feels about the enslaved people. She says that they are, inherently bad. She does not liberate people when she can. There's just no question about it that she wouldn't have done it. So why did he put that in? we don't know. Martha doesn't have any intention to do so. I think she's pretty livid, though, because Washington did do this as a bit of legacy building, as Mount Vernon tries to do when they put this very positive spin on it. And Washington had it circulated. So all of those people knew that Martha, living or dying, was what stood between them and freedom. And so Martha starts to fear for her life. And we know this because Abigail Adams talks about it. Bushrod Washington, who was a justice in the Supreme Court, a nephew of Washington's, he talks about it. And she decides a year later that she will, in fact, emancipate them. That backstory is also not really told. It's also told in this celebratory tone. And so I would say that we have a contentious working relationship, which, you know, we'll revisit next year with the paperback. But we've discussed all these things quite openly. Yeah.
It's fascinating to hear how that particular space continues to be seemingly kind of stuck in a particular time. There's a certain kind of stasis to it. But I wonder if we can make that connection then between Mount Vernon and the broader concept of the archive. I know that you worked with a number of digitized sources, the National Archives Founders Online, for example. But there is a tantalizing kind of paper trail throughout the biography itself. The idea that Washington and Martha burned letters or destroyed letters. And so there is a certain reading between the lines that has to happen with any kind of archival engagement. But I wonder about your relationship to sources, and you've touched upon the way in which other biographers often lean particularly heavily on secondary sources, but how you came to the primary source and what, as a scholar, it was like working with digitized sources as opposed to the physical kind of manuscript.
I think there is no more blessed historian or biographer than one who works in presidential archives. When you are researching most people, it is wonderful if they have an archive. It is great if someone has processed it, meaning that the person is still living who received the archives, the boxes, the letters, the manuscripts, and they went through and they read them and they said, this is here, this is there. When you get to a president like Washington, Jefferson, Adams, not only have these items been digitized, they have been hyperlinked. There were endnotes by someone like Bill Ferraro, the incredible series editor who was my fact checker and is now, you know, a good friend. He has spent decades on this. And so you have an advantage. And that's not the only advantage, that you sort of have a built-in research assistant, but also that there has been funding behind this. And again, this is unprecedented in things outside of presidential history. In Founders Online, you do have to pay for some access to the rotunda, for example, through UVA, but anyone who is watching at home, Google Founders Online. It is so much fun. It's my random Googling. It's what I do instead of, I guess, what I did when Tumblr was a thing, you know. I love to just put in random search words and see what comes up. And you can do that from your home. And what was amazing about that is, again, the access. Everything is open and available, and there's so much of it. There's too much of it. And so I tried to really prioritize the letters that everyone used and ask myself why. When I would read the whole letter, I wouldn't just copy the quote or find the quote to make myself feel good about the effort that I was doing, instead of just quoting the secondary source or pretending I had found it. I would actually read the whole letter, and then I would read around it, because there's this great, they even do the citations for you. There's this great sidebar where they have the citations, and they have, previous letter, all letters. And I would just mess about. I just click on different things, different search words, see where it took me. And I found out really fun things like Martha Washington liked dogs. That's important to know. It's as important to know about the dehumanization of the people she owned as that she liked dogs. And that sounds trivial, but it's not when you're building a biography, because we are all people and we have lots of different parts to us. And it's just not my job to judge, it's my job to present. And so those things are really really important. You can search one word, and this is going to sound, we recently heard the word puppy be used. And puppy was used in Hamilton, the musical, and it was also used, it's sometimes used in politics today, and it's an insult. You can look up puppy and you can see all the different ways it was used, because in fact, it is sometimes used just for a small, adorable dog. But a small, adorable dog is also sometimes called a slut. And so Washington's, house manager writes to him and says, I'm so sorry, a slut died in the straw. And so we know the slut is a dog, and Martha would be very upset to learn that this dog had died. But we also know that slut appears in a very bad poem that Hamilton wrote when he was 17, and he submitted for publication. We know that it's something that Jefferson told his daughter not to be, but not in the way that we think of it as promiscuous. He thought of it as being sort of slovenly, coming down to breakfast and not being totally put together. And so the access is not just for historians, but for anyone who wants to know about the founders, because we are often told the founders this, the founders that. See for yourself, they're your founders too.
And what was your kind of broadening around the subject? What particular areas did you feel a particular need to delve into, even though you don't, for example, write specifically about the battles? Were you really thinking about the French and Indian Wars, for example, the geography of the Ohios? How else did you immerse yourself in this subject?
All of the above. Again, I think for maps and for cartography in general, the NYPL is great, but a lot is handed to you. UVA has things digitized at the George Washington papers. I had tons of printouts. As I moved through his life, I would shift. I have behind this camera, my phone, I have a big cork board, and it has a lot of different push cushions. And then there's some Washington stuff behind. I've sort of cleared it out, but I do have a lot going on. And as I move through, I change it. But I really try to look at, again, like what was he looking at? What was he using to get a sense of him? And I am not a military historian. And so even in order to make, a 3 or 4 page list of battles, I had to read about all the battles. And so I read quite a bit of information that never made it in. I also, knowing that Mary Washington was literate isn't enough. I needed to understand what class was in Virginia, which is not an approach that people usually take, because they assume that Washington, he's temporarily poor. He's the eldest son from the second marriage, but he's going to be rich again. So it's fine. That's not how I see it, because he lived this life from the time that he was 11 years old until, he was able to live on his own. But there were times where he couldn't even feed his horse. He says later on, I was so poor during that time. It was incredible. And so I read about that, and I read about what is motherhood during this time. And there's a great historian named Martha Saxton, the only woman finalist for the George Washington Prize, the $50,000 that I mentioned. This year it was 7 white people, 1 woman. And her earlier work on motherhood was incredible. And we talked quite often on the phone. Her book came out, the manuscript and the galley came out right after I turned in my book. So I didn't actually get to read it. And of course, there were so many things I wanted to quote from, but I acknowledge her as well in our conversations. And that was something interesting. I just wanted to be curious about things that they were interested in, like the battles, these past biographers, but also things that they were not at all interested in, that I saw around. So if you go to the Mount Vernon bookstore, or you just look up early America and you look at, Amazon or bookshop.org or wherever you like to look at books, and you can see books in conversation with each other. You can see, okay, there's a book about Martha. If I click on that, I know I'm going to start to get book recs about women, and you sort of go down there. And that's what I did. I did sort of, I tried to consider every angle and cast the net as widely as possible. But there's no definitive biography. That's why we need one, a new one constantly. We need it from every generation. It's a sort of funny thing when they say definitive biography. I think people don't understand it. To a researcher, to someone who works in a presidential biography or a presidential library, we think of that when we say definitive, we think of it as a great research tool, right? If you looked at my Chernow biography, which by the way, when people say they love Washington biographies, our books are usually paired, which people find hilarious, but of course, it makes perfect sense. I love Chernow. I just wish he would stick to the facts a little bit more, but I love him. He's a great writer. And all these books need to exist, but Chernow's book, it is cut up, it is ripped up, it is bookmarked, it is water damage. And if you go to an archive, you will see an archivist grab what they see as the best book. They would maybe even call it definitive, but they would understand that that can't possibly be true. It's really just that it is exhaustive for right now.
Yeah. I just want to touch very quickly, and then I think we'll go to a question from the audience. But in terms of casting a wider net, I'm also interested in your work as a public historian, and you served most recently as a consulting producer on the series Washington, alongside Doris Kearns-Goodwin, who's the executive producer. You're a host of a podcast, co-hosted Presidents of People Too, another podcast. And so I wonder how you think about public history in different spaces, through different mediums, for example, what it means to bring Washington's life to life through television or through the audio of a podcast, of speaking into someone's ear about this particular person or subject or topic.
The Washington series was a great surprise and a wonderful thing to do right after I had finished the first draft of the book. A lot of these experiences that I had reading, I then experienced in the writer's room, because I was in the writer's room with, 3 men who came from the entertainment world, but did not come from the world of history. And they were immediately wanted to talk about Lexington and Concord. Washington was still in Virginia. He hadn't even decided to join the revolution yet. So we can't talk about that. So I had to sort of like relitigate a lot of fights that I had in my head, which was nice and definitely helpful with the second draft. But it's very different because it's for the History Channel. It is, so I felt like I had to choose a lot of battles, and Doris was coming in and out, but as an executive producer, you're not always there. But I did have the Doris card because I was the historian. And so she's wonderful in that way. She is an expert on, Roosevelt, Kennedy, LBJ. Washington was somewhat new to her. And so she very much sort of handpicked me as a guide and as someone to be in the room. And I found conversations with her obviously to be incredible. I love working in different mediums. I think it's really fun. I think that the history changes quite a bit. When I was in grad school, I came back from a conference and I was a little bit depressed at the small reach. And I had been so excited about a panel that like devolved into a weird fight over terms. And we never even got to the papers, and it was sort of heartbreaking. And at the time I lived across the street from the Brooklyn Historical Society. So I walked over there, and when you work, I think it's different now, but even, 2009, when I finished, public history was not something we were really told about. We weren't given a roadmap to any career outside of being a professor or being a history teacher in high school. Those were sort of the options that were given to you, which is a whole different conversation. But I didn't know if they had any use of me, but they did, of course. And then my boss there told me the New York Public Library had an opening, and I worked in the exhibitions department and had the best view into how people interact with history. It was the best job for too many reasons to go into, but in particular, I could sit in Gottesman, which is this huge, elegant exhibition hall, and I could sit on a bench and I could watch people interact with an exhibition. And I would sit there for hours, and I would just come in and out, and I would watch people and see what they paused over, like a slow walking pause, what they actually stopped at, what never got anyone's attention. And I really tried to internalize that. And I think that idea, I don't necessarily think about my reader in a specific sense, but I think about, if if someone's walking by, I guess I always fundamentally think of my reader or as my audience, my listener, whoever, as someone walking by an exhibition. And that's my opportunity to keep them engaged. And I do that in whatever way I can, as long as it is fundamentally rooted in the primary sources. And so to me, even though I am now an independent historian is what we would call me. I publish books with houses. You know, I definitely I am a working historian, but I do fundamentally think of myself as a public historian, and will show up at any Zoom high school, at any talk. I will auction off, you know, book club talks, whatever it is, because in the end, it belongs to all of us. And all I did was resurrect it in a different form, based on the great work of people who have come before me and who do this every day in the archives. And we do it for everyone else because we want the history of America to, if we can understand it a little bit better, we will understand our country better. And that is, I think, a goal that is shared. And it's a really beautiful thing. And it's always been really important. People don't go into this to make money or be famous. We go into this because we love what happens behind those locked doors, and we love getting the stuff out to you to see. And we do it because it is a goal that we have, and we don't really know how you're going to use it, but that's what we hope for.
One closing question for you, Alexis. This is actually from Travis Whitlock. And he says, I've studied George Washington for several years. One of his best traits was the ability to project a sense of well-being for an early nation. I wonder how opportunistic he was and his attitude toward risk. So it's quite a grand question that is tapped, you know, directly to the concept of the early nation, but would love to hear your thinking.
It's a great question. It's a great question. Washington was quite, when we talk about ambitious men, which Washington does in his farewell address, he warns the nation to be wary of ambitious men who care about nothing but power. And they won't reflect the desires and the needs of the citizens. And then they're open to foreign influence, and it goes from there. But there is absolutely, and Doris actually said this, there's no person in history who has either aspired to the presidency or ascended to the presidency who isn't ambitious. It's not a bad thing. Ambition is essential. I am ambitious. I would guess that you are too. It means that we work really, really hard, and that we have goals. Some of them are defined and some of them aren't. And I think that he was in step with the nation. He had great ambitions for the nation as well. And at the same time, of course, he was calculating. He learned to control that ambition. And this is a true evolution. This is definitely, say what you will about his feelings about slavery. I disagree. I don't think it was an evolution over time. I think it was a legacy building, as I've made clear, but I think that his true evolution was the ability to care about others and to have empathy. And that came over time. When he was young, and he did feel poor in comparison to his half-brothers and to other people in Virginia, people he aspired to be. He was demanding. He tried really hard to be at the center of his nation's story when that nation was not called America. We were still a colony, and he wanted to fight for them. And the only reason he stopped is because they wouldn't promote him. And there's this letter that I spend quite a lot of time on in the book, in which Washington is fighting in the French and Indian War, and he's just caused an international incident through just youthful, he's not experienced, and a lot of things have happened. There's a lot of tensions between the French and the Indian guides, the Half King. It's a whole complicated story. But when he goes to tell the royal governor, his boss, about the assassination of a French diplomat by his team, he waits 3 pages. And what he's doing for those 3 long, and I'm talking about pages in the 18th century, so these are really long pages. He's complaining about his pay. He's complaining about the way the British subjects treat him because, you know, he's a second-class citizen. He goes on and on. You lead with the diplomat's death. You don't complain about your pay. And that's something that I would say isn't a good look, but he learns to control that. And a part of it is that he marries Martha Washington, and it solves all his problems. He's rich, and that was really important to him. And then he starts to turn against the country. But once he's rich, once he has the acknowledgement of everyone in at least the colony, that he is someone to be respected, he suddenly becomes engaged with the community. And at first he's just sort of phoning it in. He runs for this office. He takes that church position. And over time, we see that he actually really does care. It's not just about him. He cares about other people, though when I am saying people, I am talking about people who he considered worth caring about. So we're still talking about white men. And then as a sort of arm of white men, you have white women, and then we keep going down from there.
Well, thank you so much, Alexis. I'm afraid we've run out of time, and I also want to thank people for joining us and hope that you will go out to buy the book if you haven't done so already. But thank you, everyone, and have a good night.
Thank you. Thank you, Louise.